I'm going to start at first principles because nobody else is. I want to ask why Britain has chosen the side of Jaish al-Islam, that is translated into English, the Army of Islam. I want to ask why a British Secret Service man seconded from the British Secret Service, an employee of the British Foreign Office, founded the so-called White Helmets, and why the British government funds them to the tune of hundreds of thousands of pounds a year. I want to ask when Britain took the policy position that we were ready to ally ourselves with the Army of Islam and send them money, millions of pounds of taxpayers' money to the Army of Islam. The clue is in the name, dear listeners. I want to ask when Britain took the policy decision that the very same people who murdered our children at the Manchester Arena a year ago, the very same people who murdered our people on Westminster Bridge, on London Bridge, in Borough Market. I want to ask when we took the decision that we were the allies of the jihadist alphabet soup of Islamist extremism that's at war in Syria. And I want to ask why no British journalist ever asks those fundamentalist questions. We haven't learned the lesson from Libya. I remember thinking as the Sky News open-top Jeep sped down the highway between Benghazi and Tripoli, filled with bearded men with weapons shouting, Allahu Akbar. I remember wondering if the telly-dollies and the men were much worse. On the open-top trucks following them and filming them, which part of the slogans of the Libyan rebels they didn't understand. I want to ask why we funded and gave safe haven to the Libyan Islamic Fighting Group. Clue was in the name, dear listeners, who came back to slaughter our children at the Manchester Arena. In short, I want to ask why we chose the side that we've been on for 7 long years. I'm going to recount, I've done it before, the time I was trapped in a lift with William Hague, then the Foreign Secretary of Great Britain. Imagine his discomfort when the lift stopped between floors and only he and me were in the glass box. I said to him, William, you've been wrong before. In fact, you've been wrong all your life. But you've never been insane before. But the policy you are following in Syria of encouraging these fanatic, head-chopping, heart-eating, liver-eating, crucifying, mass-murdering scum called ISIS and Al-Qaeda and Jaish al-Islam and all the others of like mind is not wrong. It is actually insane. And I predicted with some accuracy that one day these people would be back here with their knives that Britain helped to provide them, and would be in our own building itself looking for MPs to murder maybe him and maybe me. In fact, they didn't get into the building, thanks to the brave police officers who stood in their way. One of them, a friend of mine, giving his life's blood in defence of the British Parliament, which had given succour and comfort, money and weapons to the very people that stabbed him to death. Just think about that. Now, this day opened at 7 a.m. Washington, D.C. time, with a madman tweeting a declaration of war, not against Syria, a somewhat broken-backed third world Arab country, but against Russia, a multiply nuclear-armed superpower, which is in Syria in significant numbers, entirely legally. Russia has had a treaty of friendship with Syria almost as long as I have been alive. Russia has a naval base and has had for more than 40 years in Syria. Its warships are there. Its air force is there. Its military forces on the ground are there. Its anti-aircraft missile batteries are there. It is locked and loaded. And the Russian ambassador to the neighboring state of Lebanon said today, you may have heard the actuality, that Russia will bring down any American, British, French, Saudi, Qatari, or any other missiles that are fired at Syria. And it will attack the platforms from which they were launched. And by platforms, of course, he means warships and fighter jets, fighter bombers that will have launched those missiles that Russia will attempt to shoot down. Nothing conceivable could be more dangerous than the moment we are now in. We have people, I just heard a caller to James Whale's earlier show, imagining that we are going to be evacuated from London this weekend. We're not. But what is happening is a slow motion beginning to what may become a third world war. Just like the slow motion beginning to the First World War, which led to the slaughter of millions of people, including many hundreds of thousands of our own people, and from which Britain never recovered. And we will not recover from this war. So, although the BBC is playing down the gravity of this situation, I know that because their best show, the PM programme, fronted by the estimable Eddie Mair, I listened to it before I came into our radio station this evening. And the story that I'm telling you had to share its space at almost equal length with sexual harassment at the Save the Children Fund, a rape trial in Ireland, which was decided more than a month ago, and a long feature on potholes. I'm not making this up. This situation could not be more grave. It is more grave than the Cuban Missile Crisis, through which I lived as quite a politicized 9-year-old kid living in a political household where the talk was of little else. I lived just across the river from the Lookers Royal Air Force Base, and I remember still one of my earliest memories, the sound of fighter aircraft taking off from Lookers, and I remember wondering if the bomb was going to be dropped. Well, the bombs, shiny, new, and smart, are going to be dropped by Donald Trump on the Russians and the Syrians in the next hours, more than likely. Why is it more dangerous? After all, the Soviet Union was, with the United States, an absolute military hyperpower in 1963. It could scarcely have been a more dangerous standoff than took place over the sighting of Soviet nuclear missiles in socialist Cuba. But there's a big difference. John Fitzgerald Kennedy would not have taken to Twitter at 7 o'clock in the morning warning Mr. Khrushchev that missiles were headed his way. The leadership of the United States, of Jack Kennedy, in defiance, of the military brass around him saved the world from catastrophe in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Donald Trump, on the other hand, appears to have been taken hostage by the military brass around him. There is no other way to explain the difference between his campaign promises to reset relations with Russia and his threats of war with Russia on Twitter today. There is no other way of explaining the difference between the tweets of Donald Trump, 1913 to 15 inclusive, railing against his predecessor, President Obama, for risking World War III with the Russians over his interventions in Syria. There is no other way of explaining it on his tweets today, because not 20 minutes after his threat of war against Russia on Twitter today, he sent other tweets, in the second of which he blamed Robert Mueller, Hillary Clinton, the Democratic Party, and the liberal mainstream media for creating this mess in relations between America and Russia, for which he said there was no reason. This, a man who not 60 minutes before had threatened Russia openly on Twitter with a war that will, in all likelihood, escalate out of control before very much longer. Let me explain to you again. They're not going to fire nuclear weapons at the Russians tonight. They're going to fire conventional weapons. And Russia is going to fire conventional weapons back. And Russians will be killed. Russian assets destroyed. And Americans will be killed. And American assets destroyed. And when the smoke clears, one side will have gained an advantage and another sustained a loss. And a double down will ineluctably follow. The next night, they will exchange weapons again, and the next night, and steadily those weapons will escalate in seriousness and power. And then comes the big one. The first use of nuclear weapons, so-called tactical, theater-based nuclear weapons by the United States, which has that use in its military doctrine, though the Russians have excluded it in their military doctrine, which states unequivocally that Russia will never be the first to use nuclear weapons in an armed conflict. So if we assume that both will stick to their long-held doctrine, the United States will fire the first nuclear weapon. And if Russia replies with a nuclear weapon, then the end of the world is a distinct and real possibility. And if that's not worth dominating the BBC News, pushing out the piece on potholes, putting a cloud even on sexual harassment at the Save the Children Fund, then I don't know why we are being forced to pay the BBC for alternate bouts of war propaganda and concealment of the trouble we're in. It's the mother of all talk shows, and it's going to rage and rage against the dying of the light.